I serve as a park ranger at a park that seems to have far more playground than actual park, which means there's tons of child traffic most days. But of course, my most days. This was back in the year of 2018, long before any crazy pandemic of any virus. There was even more on the weekends and on days that school was out. I'm older now, so my kids are grown and gone. So I enjoy my job when I got to see kids nearly every day. They didn't really seem to notice me though. I just kind of blended into the background, which is why it caught my attention one day when, on a very busy weekend, there was a little girl at the far end of the park that was smiling and waving at me. I looked around to make sure she wasn't waving to a friend or a parent or something, but no, she was looking straight at me and waving. I smiled and went back, kind of chuckling to myself, since most of these kids don't pay me any mind. My mood seemed lighter for the rest of the day after that. The following day, which was Sunday, there was just as much of a population of kids at the playground that were all scattered about. And I remember to my surprise there was that same little girl that had waved at me the day prior. She waved and smiled just as enthusiastically. My heart melted and I waved back. After all the stuff I saw in various areas of law enforcement, spanned over the years, things like that restored my faith in humanity. I got 2 days off and came back on a Wednesday. Making my rounds as usual, there were some kids, just not as many. A very common feat during the weekend and weekday. But I came back to that one playground, and there was that same little girl smiling. She was always wearing that same outfit, and she was standing in the exact same spot. That's when I began to feel differently, and even felt an open pit in my stomach. So, I smiled and waved back to her, when I noticed that she never stopped smiling, or waving. The only thing that seemed to have changed is that she was smiling bigger than the very first time that I saw her, and maybe she seemed more thin. She was near, back to a cluster of bushes that seemed to be right next to the general area, but were actually a bit further back. I decided to approach her to see what the real issue was, and as I did, I was hit with a horrifying odor. The stench of death and rotting flesh. There's a rope that was tied around her neck and her left arm in such a way that she would stand upright and have her arm raised slightly. When the bush swayed in the breeze, she looked like she was waving. Without getting into any gruesome details, she had been horribly mutilated to show that she was smiling and waving. Again, since it dealt with children, this made me disgusted. I got very dizzy, and I had to sit down. How was I the only one who had seen her since Saturday? I immediately called out and filed a report. Even my superior thought my story was strange and even suspicious, because they too wondered how I was the only one who had seen her. I wish I had a better explanation, and I feel like there were 2 deaths during the whole situation. Hers and my faith in people. I've been a ranger for well over 30 years, and at some point, they decided that they would take some of the workload off my feet and let me do most of my work at the visitor center, which is about 1/3 of the way into the natural reserve. My body appreciates their consideration for the condition that I'm in, but my mental health doesn't. Keeping on the move and always on patrol was my way of coping with things. Working out of the visitor center gave me more time to think, and that's not necessarily a healthy thing. Suffice to say, I'm divorced, and my kids, well, they don't want to talk to me. All while I'm facing my twilight years all by myself. I'm not trying to draw attention here. Those will be necessary details in just a few short seconds. They forced me to take coffee breaks if I had to go too hard for too long. I was taking one such compulsory coffee break on one of the outdoor wooden park benches, completely by myself. People don't come to the park to look around the visitor center anymore. Besides the brochures of park information, the only thing the park has to offer is the same 4 or 5 fun facts, and they've been hanging out for a long time. In fact, everybody has seen them. Nobody wants to see them again. I was quickly yanked out of my thoughts when I heard a voice that I hadn't heard for over 15 years, but recognized it instantly. It was the voice of my ex-wife, and she was calling my name. My brain was trying to come up with a rational explanation as to why I was hearing this, and then I heard my daughter's voice come out to me also, except she didn't sound like the 43-year-old woman that she had grown into. Instead, she sounded exactly the way she did when she was around 9 years old. I was anchored to the park bench for a while, terrified to move, just in case I was having a heart attack, or a stroke, or experiencing something else that would mess with my mind. Perhaps I was dying. Perhaps this was a practical joke. But who could mimic those voices so well and know my name at the same time? I decided to try a more tactical approach. I would come towards the voices, but I wouldn't answer them. There were long pauses between each call, as if my wife and daughter were waiting for me to answer. But then they would call out again, and it was in those moments that I would pick up on the direction that they were coming from. Unless my ears were lying to me, it sounded like they were coming from the woods that came right up against the physical building of the visitor center. I stepped to the trees quietly, resting when there was silence, and walking when I heard the voices. I approached the opening in the trees, and they couldn't have been more than 14 feet in diameter. It was also clustered by some low-growing shrubs. I remained hidden as best as possible. It didn't sound like the voices were coming from nearby. They were coming from that very small clearing. I didn't see how it could be possible. If my wife and daughter were there, they'd be visible, clearly, unless they were lying down while in the shrubbery. So I stared for what felt like forever. But then a shape slowly rose out of the growth, and it appeared to have 2 large black eyes that were proportionate to its head, the same way the eyes of a fly are proportionate to its head. Everything about it was just a little too long. The neck, the shoulders, the arms. It did not stand up to its full length, just high enough to get a good look around before opening its mouth and speaking with both the voices of my wife and my daughter in one, calling out to me, asking where I was and what was taking so long. Then, without noticing me, it slowly sank back down. I could see its pale-ribbed back, bent over and underneath topmost of the leaves, where it did its best to try and stay hidden. I took out my pistol, and I shot as many times as I could, before I realized that there was a problem. At least 2 good hits hit on its flesh before it sprang up and ran. I don't know if the other 3 or 4 shots hit. Miraculously, I was able to slip back into the center and not have to offer an explanation to anybody important. The older girl there that works behind the front desk asked if she had heard something dangerous, and I just told her that I saw some kids setting off fireworks. My ex-wife may be many things, but somebody with the ability, let alone the intelligence, to send some strange forest monster after me and lure me out with the sound of her voice isn't one of them. After that incident, I've kind of given into the urging of my superiors to spend more time in that area and less time tromping around outside. There are clearly more forces at work in this world that know more about me and know me better than I know myself, and the less I have to tangle with them, the better. I apologize in advance for my story being so long, but I figured I would give you the unfiltered version. Thank you. The park that I service gets little to no traffic anymore. Part of that is simply because of how small the town is. Another part of that is today's Americans just don't get out for the fresh air anymore. It's kind of sad, really. I see video games are the new fresh air of today, and tablets and phones, and electronics. A lot of them involve getting out into the wild and enjoying fresh air and hunting and surviving. Nobody is really into that anymore. People would rather literally pay money for a simulation than they could just go out themselves and do it. And yet, even as little traffic as our park gets, I still find just enough litter to make me irritated. As if people get out into nature just long enough to ruin it for everyone else. I was cleaning up some wrappers off a park bench when, among them, I noticed something different. There was one of these corn husk dolls, the kind that are fashioned after the type that Native Americans used to make. It didn't have a face, just a blank knob for a head, and 4 nubs for arms and legs. Cute and creepy. I thought to myself, until I noticed a small piece of paper rolled up and tucked into one of its folds. I unrolled it out of curiosity, and it said, "Hello there." I smirked, and threw it. After I was done picking up all the trash, I went back to my patrol car, when there was another corn doll stuck behind the handle of the door. It too had another message that it read, "I said hello." I kind of prickled and looked around. As far as I could tell, I was the only person in the park, and I hadn't seen nor heard anyone. But then again, I was very absorbed in my work when I was picking up trash. It's possible that somebody was watching me and playing an elaborate prank, just so they could do it for, giggles. Still, I didn't like to think that somebody had gotten by me like that. I quickly got inside my car, shut the door, and no sooner had I done that, I noticed a third doll sitting on my steering wheel, also having another note that said, "Could you use a hand?" I nearly soiled myself when something smacked into the windshield. It took a second to fully register, but I realized it was a severed arm and hand, cut off at the elbow. Immediately, I radioed out that we had something going on in the park, and the response came fairly quick, as you would suggest and expect. But I wasn't sure if it was soon enough to keep whoever this was inside the park. I brought everybody up to speed, and there was a very thorough sweeping. They didn't find anything. No body, no killer, nothing. Not even another doll. Forensics even did tests on the severed arm, and unfortunately found that it belonged to a child that had been missing for over 2 months. The arm that hit my windshield is relatively fresh, so that meant the kid had died recently. The rest of the day kind of went by in a haze. I felt like a failure for not catching this monster, and all the moments that I could have when he was tampering with my car. Again, we never found anything, and the person was never caught. It's a mystery that will always be left as just that, a mystery.